Welcome, everybody, to a new special installment in our Poetry Fireside Chat series. My name is David Goslin. I'm your host, and I'm here with Adam Cedia, our regular contributor. Welcome back, Adam.
Good to be back.
So we do have a special show today for the Fireside Chat series, which is dedicated to the new issue, the latest issue of New Lyre, which Adam has right there. He's actually the first one. He's gotten the first copy. I have a bigger box coming, so it's taking a while longer. But we didn't want to put this off any further because there's a lot of good stuff. And we'll be giving people a taste of that today. And just having fun with some polemics and also just exploring the actual living examples of beauty, truth, and goodness that do exist in our age. Because I think, as we all can relate to, right, we live in a pretty ugly world right now. There's a lot of ugliness. It's not all ugly. And that's part of the problem, though. When there is a lot of ugliness, we can stare too long into the abyss, right? And the abyss can stare back at us if we're not careful.
And it's not just that there's ugliness, it's that the ugliness is glorified. And that old rule of economics, what you incentivize, you get more of. And that's where we are.
Right. That's a good point. And so I think what we're here to do today really is, keeping in mind that we can only learn so much about health from studying sickness. We can only learn so much about beauty from looking at ugliness. So while people are decrying all the ugliness and problems in our society, that's technically not going to get us to the real thing, right? The real thing is other than just a negation of unhealthiness, a negation of ugliness. It takes a completely different mindset to actually create something genuinely new, good, beautiful, and true. And so we want to get into that mindset, right? And that's part of this, why we're doing this show, is we want to explore pieces and works that are living demonstrations of that idea, of how we may strive for the real thing within our own age. So we have some poems that we're going to read and discuss. And
all selected from the new issue.
Yes. So everything is from the new issue. There's a lot of exclusive stuff in the issue. And so we're just going to give people a taste of it. Some of the stuff that we're going to read today has been featured on the Chain Muse. Some of it hasn't. But we definitely encourage everybody, get yourself a copy. If you like literature, if you know somebody who likes literature, if you're depressed, if you know somebody else who's depressed, get them a copy of New Lyre, because there are good things happening right now. And I think because people have been so absorbed or distracted by the culture wars, let's say, they're missing actual good stuff that is happening. And yeah, we want to change the focus here. So let's give people a taste of that, and become a patron of the arts. Get a copy of New Lyre and join us. So, Adam, the first piece that stood out to you in this latest issue that made you want to talk about it, want to read it?
Well, the first piece I had on my list is a nice short work by a relatively new contributor of ours, but a storied publication history, Mr. Robert Funderburk of Louisiana. The poem is Fragile.
Okay. Yeah, I have it here. So here, why don't I just read it, and you'll tell us why you like it, and we'll just go from there. So this is Fragile by Robert Funderburk. She was but an errant breeze, that stirs the garb of dust, borne by reckless winds, birthing love and lust. An image in a quiet pool, flawless, filled with such promise, and then shattered by the slightest breath or touch.
What caught my eye on this is the sort of poem you would see set to music. It's short, it's very lyrical, it rhymes. I could see a modern lead being set to this,
Mm,
and it's a beautiful and accurate description of uh, the type of emotional fragility we see in some people. You know, we have this outward perfection of the mirror image that is completely distorted by the slightest touch. And then we have the analogy to the breeze. Um, it it carries things with it. And the alternation between love and lust. You know, we have indecision there. It's
mm.
it's I wouldn't say it's an extremely richly layered poem, but it's succinct and beautiful in its succinctness, and I think that's what makes it successful.
Right. And I mean, again, the German word for poetry is Dichtung, which essentially means condensed.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, we have just two little stanzas, two quatrains, right? 8 lines. But there's definitely, yeah, a communication of a pretty nuanced portrait of a soul, if we will, right? This is getting to a deeper, um, oh, the image of a wounded soul, but capturing it, number one, in a beautiful way, in a very delicate way. And there's technically a lot of paradoxes concerning human nature in even just this small piece. I mean, again, the whole paradox between love and lust. Uh, and there's this image of perfection, right? An image in a quiet pool, flawless, filled with such promise, and then shattered by the slightest breath or touch. There's a lot of this. This is a thing, right? Perfectionism, where oftentimes a lot of people who are perfectionists, they're actually some of the most, you could say, fragile, right? That everything has to be perfect because as soon as everything isn't perfect, there's just a, unwounding of everything. There's a coming apart, and there's a deep fragility and woundedness, you could say, right? Because we're ultimately all human. We're not perfect. And so these false ideas of perfection that we may all have, right, or that we've had at different times about ourselves or about how the world should be, how things could be, and that these things aren't what they are, right? We don't live in an ideal world. There is plenty of ugliness. That 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 breaks people, right? That and they go from the early idealist young person to the realist, right? Which is really just the flip side of the same thing. Now, is he saying all that here? No, technically, but by alluding to this idea of perfection, I think, this false idea of perfection, I mean, we can see this in 1,000 different ways in our society. And so this is just one case of it, which I think is captured very tenderly and
That's
thoughtfully.
an important point. I think the tone of the poem is very important too. There's no bitterness or resentment. It's almost a factual description, and I think there's even a sense of wistfulness to it. In other
Mm.
words, he's not criticizing the subject for her fragility, but treating it as part of the human condition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean that's the first part of treating, let's say, or healing any such kind of fragility is first taking that, um, you know, if you're dealing with a wounded animal, you're not there's this expression, right? If somebody's wounded or fragile or hurt, you don't come at them, you know, aggressively. It's that lack of love, right? We see right there, birthing love and lust, right? There's a confusion of many different things, and so this person is wounded by that. And how do you approach that? I mean, love tends to win out in the long run. So yeah, I think the approach, the treatment is crucial if we're thinking of even on the psychological level. There's a lot of ways that you could write this poem, but for it to be truly beautiful, it requires a certain appropriate treatment. And so kudos to Robert for a rather fine little poem here. So we'll do a second one, and I'll take something from the translation section now, because that's actually one of the bangers in this whole issue. Is we got a lot of translation, a lot of exclusive stuff. So this is one piece that hasn't been published anywhere, not in this not this version of the translation for sure. This is my translation of a poem by Schiller, and I think this will speak to, you know, Schiller was writing in the late 18th century. He died in 1805 or 1812. I think it's 1805. He died at the beginning of the 19th century, and it's called Words of Delusion. And we're gonna see a theme here, and we can talk about it once I've read it. So, Words of Delusion by Friedrich Schiller, famous German poet. You know, Goethe is also often considered the greatest German poet. Schiller's probably the greatest German poet. But he gets a lot less exposure. And the more we read Schiller, the more that becomes an interesting sort of phenomenon as to why somebody like Schiller would be as overlooked as he is. But that's for another day. Words of Delusion. 3 words here's man of deep import, which fly from the mouths of the great. Their meaning loses all import and never soothes our ailing breast. Life's sweetest fruit remains but dust, so long as we in shadows trust. If one believes the golden age belongs to noble days of yore, the good and true will never wage a true victorious war. Unless uprooted at its core, evil returns forevermore. If one believes that fortune's blooms are but the fruit of noble race, evil's lush lips will make her swoon, will never see a peaceful day. Mankind will always vainly roam, searching for its long-fabled home. If one believes that truth can stand before the stern logic of men, even the wisest, gentlest hand will never lift its veil again. It may be mimed or caught with words, but still its spirit escapes onwards. Free thyself from elusive words. In thy heart let true beauty grow. What ears can't hear and eyes can't see, there lies truth in crystalline flow. Not found upon some fabled shore, she waits within forevermore. What is he saying? Your first impression, and I'll say why or if you have one, or if
No,
maybe
of course I have one.
Well,
There's a lot in here. But what jumps out to me most significantly is the rejection of the idea that there needs to be some return to a golden age of the past. And I think that dovetails nicely with the theme of this issue, which is the Renaissance.
mhm.
The Renaissance was, in one respect, um, a revival of the classical ideas of beauty and truth and education and freedom, really the last in a series of attempts throughout the Middle Ages to revive classical culture that had all been short circuited for one reason or another. But at
Mm,
the same time, the Renaissance wasn't a complete looking back, a complete revival. Um, it was a revival of the classical culture within the Christian context,
mm,
and within a culture that spoke a different language. Yes, Latin and Greek were studied, but you also had the development of vernacular literature really for the first time, especially with Dante and um,
Petrarch, Boccaccio.
Petrarch and Boccaccio. Yes, exactly. And then in Montaigne in France and etc. And Chaucer in England, you could say as well. Um, but the mistake I think many people, especially those uh, with an eye towards timeless aesthetics, the trap they tend to fall into is we need to return to a golden age. We need to return to this prior period. And I've thought these too, but the more you think about it, no, there's this good, but there was this bad,
Mhm.
and really, Schiller sums it up in the last stanza. Um, Not on some fabled shore, truth waits within. What if if we want to bring about a golden age, that old cliche, if not us, who, if not now, when. That's
Mm.
true. It's up to us, and under the circumstances we find ourselves in now, to do what we can with what we have. um it's not enough. Like he says, if you look towards some fabled golden age, evil's going to triumph,
Yeah.
because you're not doing anything about it in the present.
Yeah, and I mean, hey, this poem, this is probably, I mean, I actually thought about this. I mean, we could talk about this theme for a long time. There's a whole theme here. Technically, it could be a presentation, it could be an entire show. But I mean, just a few remarks that at least get to some of this. He talks about a golden age. Number one, whenever it's something over there or in the past, technically, spiritually, psychologically, you're telling yourself it's not now, that it's something in the distance. So you're technically putting it out of your reach just by the way you're thinking. And I mean, we can see that today in a lot of the way people think about us, when they're dealing with the culture wars or it goes. I think he's got three words of delusion here, right? So there's three polemics. Number one, if one believes the golden age belongs to the noble days of yore. Then he talks about if one believes that fortune's blooms are but the fruit of noble rays. So good things happen only when it's a good, everything is perfect and hunky dory. And then if one believes that truth can stand before the stern logic of men, also very interesting one. And when we consider his time, the where Kant was held up as like the supreme sort of philosopher, when I mean, for all intents and purposes, this is a very anally retentive personality that really said you couldn't even, beauty wasn't something that could be objectively defined because technically it couldn't be subjected to his rigorous rules of logic, and so beauty had to be
and
something subjective. And
and
see, this
Kant,
just yeah,
and Kant was a he placed his philosophy was a restraint on the capabilities of human reason, which is it limited, or I should say it defined human reason as limited, which it is, but I think it unduly restricted the capabilities of the human mind and human reason.
I mean, it did a lot of things. One of the point that Schiller makes, he wrote a series of letters, 27 letters on the aesthetic education of man. Probably one of the best things anybody could read, technically, if they want to resolve all these paradoxes that all the art critics and people across the ages, if we go into academia and we hear all the comparisons and people that they're talking about, if you read Schiller's 27 letters on the aesthetic education of man, you can pretty much refute most of these false debates versus objective versus subjective beauty, the Apollonian versus the Dionysian, all these kind of things, the right versus the left, the liberal versus the conservative. All these things are resolved through beauty in the works of Schiller, and very explicitly in the letters on the aesthetic education of man. But he makes the point as well that for Kant, morality is just this question of pure duty. Like you have the categorical imperative and these things where it's basically a formula. Like, what's the right thing to do? Well, plug it into the categorical imperative formula, and you'll know if it's the right, if you should be doing it or not. And the point that Schiller made, though, is that that's pretty much just making man a slave to reason, rather than reason, beauty, truth being things that we desire and love and seek to pursue. You're making people robotic. I guess this is the classical, this is how a lot of, let's say, conservative ideology and ethos is also trashed, and understandably so, when people are reduced to like these automatons. Everybody's just supposed to follow the rules and fall in line. But then the question is, well, where's the love, right? Like, why are people doing what they're doing? Is it in their hearts? And so technically, I think Schiller was in many ways intervening on the ossified spirituality of his times, right? Where there was a lot of, ostensibly Christian governance, but it had lost its spirit and its soul. And I remarked that, Goethe, Schiller, Shelley, Keats, none of these great writers seem to have trouble, identifying themselves with the state religion, we'll call it, in that time, because I think they saw what the people were like that supposedly embodied it, and it wasn't very impressive. But it's because it wasn't the real thing. I'd say, going back to Christ, the idea was, if it's not in your heart, right? If you're just following laws, the power of sin is the law. Or as St. Jerome in his first letter put it, where there was most law, there was also most sin. So the idea that everything, goodness, truth, and beauty, is something that you're going to legislate and, enact and sort of dictate by rule, that doesn't work. Hence why, Jesus himself said, I haven't come to change the law, I've come to fulfill it. And to fulfill it, there had to be a change in the heart of men. Otherwise, you just get hypocrisy. You get the ugliness that we have today, where people mouth one thing, but in their hearts, there's something else. And you just get this very perverse, superficial thing going on, right? There's two worlds. And so how do you actually bridge those worlds so that you actually have a genuinely meaningful and beautiful society? I think Schiller was getting at all of this. And, just to come back to this poem, this is a theme that you'll see in Schiller, is always the idea of the beautiful soul. And how do we cultivate beautiful souls? Which I think is really is technically speaking to the genuine Christian ethos, which is that, you're supposed to embody these principles of love and truth. They're not just these doctrinal abstractions that we're supposed to talk about, and then in real life, the people are actually very, boring and unimpressive and quite hypocritical. It's not a good look. So how do we intervene on that? I think this is what you see from somebody like Schiller. This is what you see with Christ's intervention. And this poem technically is a polemic against the the false ways of thinking that most people who aspire to this a golden age of goodness, truth, and beauty, where they think it's, with a perfect, you know monarch, trad monarch, or whether they think it's a perfect egalitarian society that is, somewhere in the future, golden age in the future. None of that's the real thing if we can't embody and capture these things, find these things in ourselves. So as the closing thought on this poem that I comes to mind, is that there's a golden age inside each one of us, right? We're talking about a golden age in the past or in the future, and people are saying we just need to like copy something. But he says, not found upon some fabled shore, she waits within forevermore. I think each one of us has a golden age. And if we're to
She's
get an
waiting,
idea,
and she's waiting. It's up to us to bring her out.
yeah,
With that, we have 2 minutes left.
perfect. So if we're waiting for something to kind of sort of come save us, I mean, to use another story, I recently, somebody had mentioned this one. Do we want to be healed? Do you want to be healed? Right? When Christ went to the leper, you know, he asked him that, there's the mirror. It wasn't, there oftentimes people think of miracles in different ways, right? But when he went to the leper, he didn't just, you're saved. He said, do you want to be healed? There has to be a decision internally, right? For people, if a lot of big miraculous changes are to happen, I think it starts with having an experience of how we change ourselves. And the first is making a decision and wanting. So, Adam, what was the next poem that you wanted, that caught your eye?
I was impressed by the work of a young poet out of Vermont, Gabriella Miller, and the poem is called Euphoria.
Yes. Okay. Euphoria. Yeah. Gabriella Miller. We published this one a while back on the Chained Muse. And given that it really is a pretty wonderful piece of writing, we wanted to make sure that it was included along with a lot of the exclusive stuff in New Lyre, because we're trying to, this is a proof of principle, right? We're trying to demonstrate what timeless literature today looks like and sounds like, and that we don't need to be running after some golden age in the past or future, but actually just try and get in touch with ourselves and our deeper selves and the deeper nature of our species today. And then a lot of things start to become clear, and we don't need to go out running after something in the past or in the future. We can do things right now and get to the real thing right now. So this is a fun piece, Euphoria by Gabrielle Miller. She's a young writer in Vermont. Last I heard, she was in her bio, she was studying at Vermont, I believe she's probably graduated by now, but young lady from Vermont, Euphoria. We'll get your comments right after this, Adam. So it goes. Euphoria. I cut my finger. The sanguine smell permeates the air like petrichor. The blood flows slow like caramel, delighting in its long encore. My clothes wear me like gossamer, and I choke the sea with my bare hands. They ask me which would I prefer, hell, high water, or wonderland. My loneliness is fast renewed, the poisoned air perfumed with death. Like a hummingbird, I crave solitude, and in 7 minutes, I take 7 breaths. I hear my heart beat like a lullaby that ticks away its lifelong debt, a sound that subtly signifies each epoch until the next sunset. The red sun is my paragon, both somber and ephemeral. It sinks into oblivion, like flowers yielding to my call. The world loves pandemonium. In everything, I see dysphoria. Like Novocaine, my thoughts go numb. And this is my euphoria.
This this was a fun poem to read.
Yeah.
And I'll start with the comment, the overall tone, and I mean no insult by this, is it almost sounds like, goth poetry
Mm,
or emo poetry, except it's good. That's the difference.
right.
Um, it is a very somber poem, and it articulates a very somber outlook on life. There's nothing good seems to be going on here.
Mm,
Um, the cut on the finger, the clothes don't look good, the loneliness, the thinking about death, and the heart beating away, ticking away time, and the sunset. Yet there's a overarching irony by the title Euphoria, and that's the closing line. My thoughts go numb, and this is my euphoria. um and the irony is, despite the overwhelming negativity of everything that's
mm,
been articulated before, there's
mm,
that power to still find joy, even if it's just by shutting out everything emotionally. We can have a debate with psychologists about whether that's a healthy thing, but at the end of this dark poem, there's a finding of there's a place of joy, and it ends on a high note. And the other thing I really liked about this was just the playfulness with the language. We have the
very,
my clothes wear me. We have references to come hell or high water. Um, we have the dysphoria and euphoria, rhyming pandemonium with numb, which I think is extraordinarily clever. And there's a lot of good turns of phrase in this.
yeah. I mean, again, this is a very good poem for many different reasons and on many different levels. Just you're saying with the language. I mean, yeah, just the rhymes, right? You see people who are trying to rhyme today. Again, they harken back to some golden age of poetry, and then you see what some of this quote unquote formal poetry sounds like, right? It's very sing song. It's like trite, bad commercial jingles.
And
Um,
sing song is good there if you want it to sound that way, but the problem is
right.
a lot of serious poetry ends up sounding like a commercial jingle because it doesn't adapt the meter and rhyme to the tone of the subject. I mean, the relationship between subject and form is a very careful one that can be botched really easily. And this is a
Yeah.
poem I think that pulls it off quite well.
And the irony, I mean, again, euphoria, pandemonium, and the language is there's a lot of imaginative freedom, right? There are a lot of degrees of freedom in how the language is doing all sorts of things, and yet everything is perfectly under control, right? The theme seems to be one of well, euphoria, pandemonium, unravel. They don't sound like things where things are completely under control, and yet the control of the stanzas, right? The control of the language, rhyming, petrichor, encore, smell, caramel, all things that you wouldn't even think would necessarily um, work, and yet everything is coming together with such virtuosity and control. It's not there. It's not even showing off, right? It's really just bringing everything together in a thoroughly composed manner. And I mean, and this is what I think it's really about, because somebody who can do that, then there's all sorts of things become possible, right? In terms of we start taking on exploring different kinds of themes, right? Start revisiting old themes that we thought were dated or whatnot. With this kind of originality and craftsmanship, uh, a lot of things become possible. So it's definitely a poem that when people get the issue, they should definitely study this one closely. And we do sincerely hope that the muses continue to seek Gabriella out. And so, with
Yeah,
that
and I
said,
just want to add one point to what you and I think you touched on an important point that we don't emphasize enough. Um, when we talk about timeless poetry, so much of that is just attention to craft. So
mm,
much of uh, free verse today is often used as an excuse for sloppiness, and so much of what you read out there, you can tell there it was just diarrhea of the pen spilled out on a page, and there was no crafting to it. Um, in prose writing, there's a good essay, and I can't remember who the author is. I encountered it years ago for law school writing. Actually, there's four roles a writer wears: the architect, the oh gee, the I'm sorry, the madman, the architect, the carpenter, and the judge. The
mm,
madman just throws the ideas on paper as they come to him. The architect gives it an overall structure. The carpenter focuses on craft and grammar and details, and the judge weighs, is this the impression I want to convey? How does the writing convey the ideas behind them? And
mhm,
each writer wears those different hats at different times. And I think there's too much madman writing in what we call contemporary poetry and not enough of the other roles. You have to have
right.
balance of all of those to make good. And this was in the context of prose writing. I think it applies even more so in poetry, which I've heard characterized as writing under stress, which I think is a good way to put it.
I mean, again, the problem with this show is we could keep going on.
Yeah,
Everything
yeah.
becomes a rabbit hole here. But absolutely. And I mean, again, there's a lot of these fads, right? Like in a lot of contemporary art, like, oh no, it's good, it's raw. Like, don't refine it, don't impose structure, right? We want like something organic and raw. But that sounds nice. And I mean, there's the idea. Here's the thing, right? We can understand where that's coming from in the sense that when you're in a society that's where everything is very formalized, right? We can go back to the whole cultural um the counterculture, right? Where there was a rebellion, you wrote an essay on this, Adam, with the beat poets and all
Yes.
that, where there was an attempt to cast off these kind of uh, stultifying or overly formalized structures, right? Where conformity, right? Today, it's gone the other way, where everything is like super. We can say like decadence and things are all over the place, and so there's an idea of like people like society has rules, society has laws, whatever, and it's nice to feel safe when you're going down the street. I live in Montreal here, and I've even noticed the change in the city. I'm like, it's getting a bit weird. Like it's always been weird, but now you feel a bit less safe, and that's not a cool
Well,
feeling.
I live about 45 minutes from Chicago, which has been, the paragon of that sort of development.
Yeah, and so we're saying this though just to say that always this divide between the Apollonian and the Dionysian, and so the Apollonian wants everything to conform to certain ideals and abstractions of perfection and form and order, which is on itself is all important, necessary, and good. But again, how one goes about that and what that looks like in the real world, when you see people trying to enact their ideals, it often isn't it's not very good. And it just shows that metaphysics is actually something that takes serious minds. And when you have people who haven't done all the work, you get really bad things in the real world. And so the flip side is the Dionysian, right? Where it's the pure sort of liberality towards everything and anything, and compassion and whatnot. And you see though, when you enact those things and you try and make society conform to either of these abstractions as just abstractions, it doesn't it gets a bit out of hand. And so we see, I walk downtown and you see like some of the sculpture or like the art, right, that's displayed like in the public squares, the stuff that like we're supposed to, we want people to be inspired, right? We want people to have a sense of, when you see something that has great harmony, that awakens your own inner sense of harmony, right? It's not just these images, they have an effect on our society. But when it goes the other way, with like the super abstract stuff, it's some abstracted emotion of, like you can imagine like the Pollock kind of like that's the epitome of that. It's just paint spurts and it's all our emotions and whatnot, but to the point that it's not even intelligible anymore. So this idea of like a raw emotion, okay, raw anger. Let's say somebody's raw angry. Um, I mean, if we're going into the depths of it, even from the psycho spiritual standpoint, anger is it's recognized, it's known that it's usually a cover for deep sadness. So even these people who believe that there are just these self-evident things and we just want things in their raw, authentic form. And so that if you impose rules or order on it, you're losing that authenticity, that vitality. That's true if it's not done the right way, right? That's true if you don't have a genuine artist. It's not in the hands of somebody who can wield their craft and their material and their themes. Or, if you're a philosopher, you're thinking about or a statesman, and it's about the ordering of society. Again, are you able to deal with metaphysical concepts in a way that you can actually apply them to the real world? Or are you just, a charlatan or an ideologue, or worse? All this comes into play, I think, if we're really discussing art on the highest level, the implications, and what kind of universe is reflected by the kinds of works that people offer up, right, and produce. The Apollonian and the Dionysian, it exists if we're not, that dichotomy, that false dichotomy exists if we haven't made certain epistemological leaps in our thinking. But when we look at a great piece of art, these false oppositions, they disappear, I would argue. All the more why it's important that we continue to, see good art and have good art that reminds us of what the real thing can be. That was a long rant. So now we're going to go to a poem. But yeah, I mean, it elicits, poetry elicits a lot of thoughts.
Well, that's why
So
we do the podcast, is not just to read out poems.
yeah, yeah. I mean, this is probably the best. This is probably the best pairing, right? It's not just riffing, but we're actually looking at genuine examples. So with that said, this is I was thinking which one should go next based on our discussion. Did you have another one, Adam? Let's go with what you.
All right, the other one I picked, we could either do Mar de Oces or When Lilacs Die. I'll let you pick which one.
Let's do the. I mean, they're both good. Let's do When Lilacs Die. Yeah, because this is this one you won't find anywhere but in the journal.
Okay.
And there's a lot again, we only have so much time here. We could spend probably, I mean, we could spend many months working through all the exclusive stuff in this issue, but yeah, we just want to encourage, give people a taste of it. So when lilacs die, okay.
By Paul Gallagher, a frequently featured poet on the website.
Yeah, who's for a long time uh spent his life dealing with all things concerning classical art, classical culture, classical education. Yeah, I've known Paul for a while. We've corresponded for a while. I once visited him. He lives in Virginia, and yeah, so I think this is a fun poem, and you'll tell us why you like it, Adam. So
Okay.
here, I'll read it. When Lilacs Die by Paul Gallagher. Lilacs clustered on the bushes there, so sweet they take our breath, and stir the wind to scent the soft spring nights with joy and care, then quickly wilt away. Leave us to bear the silent summer days that never end. Heroes, like the brilliant colored rose that stands on its long stem so proudly high, yet furls its facets in a tight enclose, until at last the lovely torsion goes. We long for change when heroes pass us by. Angels, though, are not seen till they've gone, for they live as you and I, and strive as we, but hidden in a time that's farther on, where they have other souls we lean upon, and draw us towards the ones we wish to be. Hmm.
First comment is it's an interesting form. I originally thought this might have been a sonnet, but there's 15 lines instead of 14. So it's an original form that I won't say is it depends on the sonnet because there is a little bit of a turn there in the middle, but
Hmm.
it's not quite a sonnet. And it does have a rhyme scheme to it. But what I like about the poem is, anyone who's had a lilac tree or been around lilacs knows the smell, and you can smell them from far away, and it's 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 lovely, and it lasts only a few days and then they're gone.
Hmm.
It's just what this poem does is it shares that common experience between the narrative voice and the reader, um that sort of mournfulness about something beautiful that's ephemeral. And at the same time, it 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 teaches us a lesson at the end. um Angels, though they are not seen till they've gone, for they live as you and I and strive as we, um and draw us towards the ones we wish to be. I left out some stuff there, but it's, even though they've gone, even though these angels, we'll call them, have gone, they leave something within us, that we take with us. And you can say that about people we've loved or have been important to us, whether they've died or we've just lost contact. They've left their impression on us, and we take something from them. Um, so in this way, the ephemeral transcends time.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean that's that's not going away, right? That whole theme, the ephemeral transcending time, and the irony that the lasting impression, right, created by this poem, or the thing that it awakens inside us, which is arguably um, undying, right? That deeper quality of soul and spirit that isn't created so much as, it's there for a moment, but it's not so much created as something that we, for a moment, are, I mean, we could say possessed by, endowed, with a living soul or a soul in a living body. And so the thing that is yet bringing our attention to that deeper thing within us is this ephemeral thing, which is quite an irony. And I think that's pretty beautiful. The lilacs, again, it's another one of these themes, right? It's not going away. There's always going to be poems on lilacs. They're just very poetic subjects, right? And I think the beauty of it is they can always be revisited. My grandma had a lilac tree, so yeah, I know. And I mean, we have a lot of lilacs here in NDG and in Montreal where I live. So it's, yeah, it was always that spring season. The air is, you're intoxicated by this amazing perfume. So absolutely. And the fact that he ties in heroes, there's a couple of turns, right? That, he switches the frame and brings in the question of heroes as well, that sort of are like these other ideals, right? Like the lilacs. So that's yeah, it's compelling. It's a poem that we can read over and ponder for a while, and draw us towards the ones we wish to be. I mean, that's also echoing, in a sense, this theme that we're touching on of a golden age. And rather than it being this thing that we're sort of, well, that's in the distance. Here it is in the distance, but it's something that we strive for. And in that sense, it becomes something immediate, right? That we can strive for now, rather than, waiting for some golden age, right? For everything to just, for the stars to be aligned and for everything to just happen. That's not the real thing. So yeah, I like this poem. I think it's a poem, as Robert Frost said, begins in delight and ends in wisdom. And I think this is a fun little example of that. How are we doing for time, Adam?
Oh, I didn't time what time we started.
That's okay. When it comes to
We're
work,
probably at like close to the 10-minute mark.
okay. So you know what? Let's yeah, there's a lot of translations that we could read. Some of them are longer. I do like this one by Michael Birch, though. This is a short poem, and this might not be a bad one to close on, actually. So yeah, we can close on that. But there's another. Yeah, let's close on this one. And a lot of the exclusive stuff will remain a mystery until people get the copy. But this is just a fun one. It's a nice one to read and to discuss and to give people a taste of, again, the quality of things we're seeking to highlight here. Infinity by Michael R. Birch. Michael Birch, regular contributor at the Chained Muse, very talented poet, great craftsman as well, knows his stuff and always manages to create a magical moment with his poems, which is, I think, crucial in what poetry is really all about. At least has to have magic, right? No matter what it says, and all the other stuff we can discuss after. But if it lacks magic, I mean, what are we doing? So, Infinity by Michael R. Birch. Have you tasted the bitterness of tears of despair? Have you watched the sun sink through such pale, balmless air that your soul sought its shell like a crab on a beach, then scuttled inside to be safe, out of reach? Might I lift you tonight from earth's wreckage and damage, and on these waves gently rising, to pay the moon homage? Or better, perhaps, let me say that I too have dreamed of infinity, windswept and blue. Again, very short. Michael recounted I mean, he wrote this poem when he was quite young. He's still in his teenage years, which is quite impressive, and showed plenty of promise. That came true. There's so we have a lot of Bersh's stuff in this issue. I like this one because it is quite it's almost like a it confesses its yearning, right? That there is a deeper yearning, and this person, might I lift you tonight from earth's wreckage and damage, right? So clearly there's a disenchantment with the world as it is, and the poem is speaking to this person, the and sharing his own, I too have dreamed of infinity, windswept and blue, right? That there's something in the distance. We're going to come back to that theme. In this case, it's the infinite. I mean, I windswept and blue, so we're thinking of the heavens, and that this is a thing that people think about. Are we allowed to think about that, right? Or are we just supposed to today, or are we allowed, but it's just some romantic teenage dream kind of thing, and then you're just supposed to fall in line?
Oh, you're weird. You're impractical. You're an idealist if you think about it.
Yeah. And so here there's a confessional tone, which is interesting, as well as, somebody trying to reach out to someone else, but that, it's okay to have these thoughts of infinity and all these things. And if anything, yeah, too many people don't cultivate that, right? R.D. Lang famously, interestingly, in he has a great book, The Divided Self. It's got problems philosophically, but he observes that there's a lot of things that people lose as they're conditioned to become well adjusted in society. And he says the first casualty is fantasy. He gives the example of little children. Little children often have imaginary personalities, right? People that they talk to, or they have and how many parents said, hey, cut that out. Hey, stop, Billy, shut up, Billy, or whatever. You don't say that, but hey, like, stop, like you have to get into the real world. That's not the real world. And at one level, we understand where that's coming from. But at the other, what happens when the imagination, right, and fantasy are altogether trained out of people, such that people just become these well-adjusted, quote unquote, well-adjusted citizens? Sounds like a nice thing. But then, when everybody's just falling in line and following the rules, all sorts of bad things can also happen, right? It's the rules, it's the law. A lot of bad things have come from people just sort of, dogmatically saying that if it's not based on rooted in truth, beauty, goodness, saying it's the law, whether in the time of Christ, right? The power of sin is the law. Everything that, or MLK even said in his speech, everything Hitler did was legal. When people start going with this, it's the law, it's the rules. It's a slippery slope if we don't have a society that's actually committed and that loves beauty, truth, and goodness. It's a very dangerous slope. So here we have a young man confessing to another person this deeper longing and yearning. And so clearly he has not let that deeper part of himself be completely severed. And so obviously there are wounds, there's pain associated with trying to maintain that and protect it and preserve it despite the hostile environment.
And my closing thoughts on this, I want to comment first on the form. I really like when English poems deviate from the iamb. It's English, it's been common, it naturally falls into iambic verse. And here we have a nice set of anapaests. Have you tasted the bitterness of tears of despair? And then we have a couple feminine endings. It's harder to do. It's hard to do convincingly in English, and I
Mhm.
think it demonstrates the high level of craftsmanship we all know in Mike's work. Um, and again, we have the contrast. This could have been set apart in rhymed couplets, either as a single stanza or as four separate, but instead it's divided into two pairs of couplets. And I think that's interesting because it mirrors the idea. On in the first hand, we have sort of, and it kind of follows the same track as Euphoria. In the first part, we have the sense of despair and longing and loss. And then
Mhm.
in the second stanza, that's transformed into um, rising beyond that to, infinity. I dreamed of infinity, to the realm of the ideal. And I think the form captures that transition perfectly. And here, this poem is a real good illustration of how content and form are interrelated in a successful poem.
Absolutely. And so yeah, it's really it's a great model. And so I would encourage anybody, I mean, not even for yourself. I mean, get this issue. This is the kind of journal you want to get for anybody who likes ideas, because as we conclude on this poem, I mean, the reality is there's also an entire essay, there's reviews, there's commentaries and criticism, there's a complete translation section, there's a complete section of original poetry. And we didn't get to talk about most of it, but you did. I don't know how we're doing for time here. Or
We
if
have
do we want to?
about 5 minutes.
So maybe just to give people a quick, you wrote an essay. Our featured essay in this issue is called "The World Needs a Renaissance, Not an Enlightenment."
Yes.
And
And I purposely, and I agree with that, but I purposely titled that as a barb to attract people's attention. What we the theme of the essay is what we call the Enlightenment. Really wasn't that. What the Enlightenment was at some level a rejection of what had been built and what the Renaissance had brought to full flourishing. So when you hear politicians or public figures talk about enlightenment values, I don't think they have a real understanding of what the Enlightenment was. It was not a period of science of great scientific discovery. It was essentially ideologues. It was development of ideology
yeah,
as opposed to philosophy. And I encourage anyone to read the essay if they want to, hear my case stated fully.
yeah, I mean, it's there to correct a lot of false assumptions that people have. And again, I mean, the theme is a Renaissance today. What would a Renaissance today actually look and sound like? And so the issue is dedicated to not just exploring that, but embodying that. So people will find there's a unified theme throughout the issue. And yeah, I mean, we could go on for a long time. There's a lot. Just that essay is going to keep people busy for a while. Um, but yeah, get yourselves copies, and we're going to continue these discussions regularly. So I mean, there's plenty more coming. This was just a little detour. We wanted to at least give people a taste of the latest production. So thank you everybody for listening, and we will be back soon with more original content and work. Thank you, Adam, for joining us.
My pleasure.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.